You know, I was thinking back this week to growing up, and I have a younger brother, just a couple years younger than me, and maybe you've experienced this if you have a sibling, but fairness is a big deal when you've got two kids in the same house. And my mom went pretty far to make sure that things were fair. And so, I mean, if it was Christmas time, I mean, she was counting gifts. She was making sure she spent the exact same amount of money. She wanted it to look like we both had the same amount of gifts. If there was a dessert, you know, we made sure that the dessert was divided equally. I think for a while, my mom even had to like count goldfish to ensure that we had the same number of goldfish. And I mean, you know, I wasn't the one that was complaining. It was really my younger brother, you know, that really made a big deal about this. But in that moment, you know, you would look and inevitably, even no matter how hard my mom tried to make it fair, maybe you've experienced this, you have that moment where you look over and the words come out of a child's mouth, but that's not fair. But that's not fair. And so often that's how we feel when we look at life. And it's interesting because we don't have to teach kids about fairness. It's not like we have to sit them down and say, hey, we need to make sure that you understand that life should always be fair. You don't have to teach kids this. They seem to figure it out on their own. It's like hardwired into who we are. There's something deep in our human condition, and we're like pre-installed with almost like a fairness meter. I mean, have you noticed kids do this? And it's so natural for us. Even before we have words for fairness, we feel it as we're growing up. And we really don't grow out of this need and this desire for fairness. It just happens to look different when you're 40 than it does when you're 4 years old. Now, it turns out Jesus had something to say about this part of us, this deep need for fairness. Jesus spoke exactly to this, which brings us to what we're going to talk about today, because we're in our sermon series, Summer on the Mount, and we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, which happens to be the greatest sermon ever preached. And it was preached by Jesus himself. And in this sermon, Jesus gives us a picture of what life in the kingdom looks like. And Jesus basically throughout this sermon is saying, hey, if you're going to follow me, if you want to know what it looks like to follow me, this is what I want to do in you. This is what I want you to live out in your life. And every phrase in this sermon matters. Every single thing that he says matters. Every phrase is packed with meaning. And what I've seen as we've looked through this sermon over the last weeks throughout this summer is that Jesus does not care. Doesn't seem to be interested in how spiritual we look. He cares way more about how we love. He doesn't seem to care how spiritual we look. He cares about how we love, how we treat one another, and that's what we're going to look at today. Now, when you look at this, I mean, Jesus seems throughout this sermon to just keep raising the bar, raising the bar, raising the bar. Every time he says something different, the bar gets raised again and again and again. And when you think that he couldn't get any hard, it couldn't get any harder, and the bar couldn't get any higher, Jesus just raises the bar again. And Jesus does that again, and he speaks directly to our instinct, our desire for fairness, this craving that we all have for balance and justice, and for people getting what it feels like they deserve. And so what I'm about to read are maybe some of the hardest words Jesus ever spoke. I mean, this is a challenging passage. And for many people, they hear these words, it doesn't even make sense what Jesus is saying. We're going to look at that today. This is our passage in Matthew chapter 5, and he says this: "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." What? "If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt or your cloak, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, why don't you go with them 2 miles? Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." You know, he just drops that in the end. Be perfect. I mean, if that's not a high bar, I don't know what is. Now, let's just be honest. When you hear these words of Jesus, doesn't sound normal. Does not sound doable. How can you live this out? I mean, who actually lives like this? Who actually turns the other cheek? Who actually gives away their coat? Who goes the second mile for the person who just humiliate them? Who loves their enemy? Who prays for the people who persecute? Who does that? This is not just countercultural. This is like counterinstinctual. This goes against the very nature of who we are as people. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for us, because so many of us, we say, I want to follow Jesus. I want to live like Jesus. I want to look like Jesus. But then when we get to the heart of it, and we look at how Jesus asks us to treat other people, to forgive other people, that's where we say, that's a path I can't walk with you, Jesus. That's where we stop short. I mean, this is a hard thing to ask someone. And so here's what I hope that we get to today. And here's what I hope we all see, is that we focus on what's fair, but Jesus focused on how far. Our focus is always on what's fair. Just like we were as kids, at the end of the day, we kind of have that same mindset. What's fair, what's not fair. Jesus didn't seem to care as much about that. What Jesus cared about is how far can I go to show love, grace, forgiveness. And so we're going to walk through 3 statements and really 3 movements that I think help us understand the progression we have to make if we're going to look like Jesus and live out these words. And the first one is this, is that we move from saying, I've gone far enough. Because we all get to that place where we feel like, I've gone far enough. I've done enough. I've loved enough. I've forgiven enough. I've tried to meet this person. They don't seem to care. I've gone far enough. But then you have to realize that Jesus went further. And then you have to get to the point where you say, if Jesus went further, then I can go further. I'm going to walk with him. So let's start with this first statement. I've gone far enough. I think we've all said that at some point. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been to the place where you're like, I've gone far enough. I've forgiven enough. That's exactly where the people who were listening to this sermon, the first century Jewish audience, that's exactly where they were. Because they had lived a life of abuse, and they were living under brutal Roman rule. I mean, they had been exploited and abused, and their land had been occupied. Taxes had been used as weapons. And their dignity had been eroded at this point for generations by the Romans who were overseeing them, and they were really exploiting them. And so as they were listening to Jesus, they didn't want a teacher. Really what they wanted was a liberator. Really what they wanted was a revolutionary. In fact, they didn't really want Jesus to just preach a sermon. They wanted Jesus to lift a sword. They wanted him to stand up to the Roman rule that had stepped on them for now generations. And so imagine the shock. Jesus steps up, and they're thinking, this is the moment. He's going to take it to Rome. He's going to lift up the sword. This is the revolution. This is how it starts. They were waiting for Jesus to say this, and instead Jesus gets up and he says, turn the other cheek. Give your coat as well. Walk the extra mile. Love your enemies. This is not what they wanted to hear. This doesn't sound like justice, right? This sounds like he's saying surrender here. And when you're hurt and you've been stepped on and you've gone through what these people went through, that is not what you want to hear someone say. You don't want to hear someone say, love your enemies. I mean, like it sounds nice on the surface, but whenever you're living out and someone's done something to you, the last thing you want to hear someone say is love your enemies. And this is true for us in our lives too. I mean, these words of Jesus, they're so powerful. I mean, they speak to us. But when they collide in our own lives with our own real life experiences, like with the pain that we've experienced, the disappointment, the exhaustions, these words don't feel like healing. They don't feel inspirational. They feel almost offensive to us. How could Jesus say this? Because what happens, listen, it sounds good on paper, but whenever you come face to face with people, situations, circumstances, and forgiveness is asked in those situations, and it's a hard situation, I mean, it is so hard for us to live out these words. When people have wounded us with their words, things they've said to us, or maybe it's just their silence. They don't talk to us at all, and we don't understand why. Or people who we've set boundaries and they seem to break those boundaries, or people who have crossed barriers or wronged us, and things that have happened to us. And all of us have situations like that. All of us can think back to situations and circumstances and people where that's been true. In those moments, what we want Jesus to say to us is, well, haven't you done enough? You can stop now, right? You don't owe that person anything. That's the word we want Jesus to say. And we want to hear Jesus say, just like walk away from this. But instead, Jesus steps into the situation and he says, go the extra mile, go further, keep walking, keep forgiving. And so Jesus says this phrase, so powerful in this passage. If someone asks you to go 1 mile, why don't you go 2? Go the extra mile. But most of us, let's just take a step back and think about our own lives. Most of us don't even want to go the first mile with someone that's wronged us. I mean, like most of us, we're like, okay, like 0.25 miles. That's as far as I can go. And for some of us, we try to walk with someone for a period of time. We try to maybe even go that first mile because like that's what we're supposed to do. That's like the duty that we have out of Christian guilt. But so often, like as soon as we get to that 1 mile marker and feel like we've done our part, we're like, I'm out. That's it. I've done my thing. And so what I would say, and maybe you could understand this too, I think every one of us kind of has a mileage limit, like how far we're willing to actually go with someone who we're struggling with. Like that, there's some limit that's set up. For some people, it's like a half a mile. For some people, like a tenth of a mile. For some people, they'll go a whole mile. But there's this invisible line. There's this moment that happens in our lives and relationships where we say, I've forgiven enough. I've walked far enough. I've tried long enough. I've carried this for long enough. And so let me ask you, and this is a hard question, but is there someone in your life right now where going one more mile just feels like too much? Is there someone in your life right now where to say, go an extra mile, it just feels like way too much to ask? Maybe it's someone that's drained you. Maybe it's someone that's hurt you, someone that's wronged you. I certainly have people like that in my life, if I were to be honest. And then Jesus says, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. And it sounds totally impossible. And sometimes it feels completely unfair. And so what I think is that we all love grace and forgiveness in theory. We all like the idea of forgiveness. We all like forgiveness whenever someone's forgiving us. We all like forgiveness when we read about it in a story or when we see it in someone else's life. But we all kind of have this sense that while there should really be grace and forgiveness with boundaries, there should be grace and forgiveness, and it should have kind of an expiration date. There's a limit to this thing that we call forgiveness. And we say things like, I've done it enough, I've taken enough chances, and this person's never going to change, I'm going to write them off. Now, I just have to pause right here and say, because I know this stirs up a lot of emotions in a lot of people, and people have all different kinds of situations that they're dealing with, and I can't pretend to understand the circumstance you're going through. I mean, there are situations that are unhealthy. There are situations that are toxic, and there are times where you just have to step back and say, this is so unhealthy for me that I can no longer walk with someone, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but let's just be honest. A lot of times we stop walking with someone way before that's true. It's not necessarily that it's unhealthy or toxic. It's just that we're fed up. It's just that we've run out of patience. It's just that we don't have the strength to go an extra mile. And so we just get to this point where we're exhausted and we're hurt and we just feel like we're done. But what's underneath that exhaustion? What's underneath that sense of like, I feel like I've gone far enough. I can't walk any further. Underneath the exhaustion, I think is something that's even deeper. There's a lie that we believe. It's that we don't trust God to make it right. In fact, I would say it like this: we don't trust God to make it right, so we have to make it fair ourselves. I mean, the reason that so often we want to get even with someone, we want to get revenge for someone, is at the end of the day, we say, God, it doesn't seem like you're handling this situation, so I'm going to have to handle it myself. I'm going to have to deal with this situation myself. And we stop walking the second mile because we think, if I don't defend myself, no one else is going to defend me. God doesn't seem to defend me. If I'm not getting even, then God seems to just let me continue to get stepped on in my life. If I don't take justice in my own hands, who's gonna handle this situation? God doesn't seem to be. And so what happens, because we don't really trust God to be sovereign, to be the righteous judge that he is, to take care of ourselves, to defend us, to protect us, is what happens is we protect ourselves, we defend ourselves, we put up emotional walls, and we protect ourselves from future pain by just kind of writing people off in our lives. And here's what this all boils down to. We think that grace should stop at enough, but Jesus always said, go further. We think grace is like, hey, I've had enough, I've done enough, that's enough. But Jesus always says, go further. And so here's the good news, though. As I say that, let me just say this. Jesus has never asked you to do something he hasn't done himself. Jesus walked further. Jesus has walked this out. He's lived this out. He shows us in his life what this could look like. And because of that, it makes all the difference. He gives us a picture of what forgiveness looks like. And so that's what we're going to look at next. That's the next point, is that Jesus went further. Now, let me just give you a little bit of context here for this next section here, because what Jesus says here is stunning, but he begins by setting up kind of the background. He understood the audience that he was talking to. He was talking to a bunch of people who knew what the Old Testament said. And so they all had this same idea of fairness, this core instinct that we all have, that things should be balanced and right. And in this moment, Jesus understands this, looks at this, and then lovingly dismantles it in front of everyone. And it's not because fairness is bad, it's just that forgiveness is better. It's because grace is better. And so he begins with this phrase that was familiar to the audience at this time. And it's a phrase that they had heard many times. Probably in their childhood, they had learned this, and it was a phrase that was common, and it's a phrase that we've heard before as well. And he says this, it's out of Matthew 5:38, and you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You probably heard that said as well. Where did that come from? Well, this came straight out of the Old Testament. These are God's words in the Exodus and Leviticus. But see, when these words were spoken, they were actually spoken to protect people. The words an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth were spoken whenever violence would escalate, and one person would take one eye, and then the next person would make that person blind, and then it would kind of escalate from there. And so this was really given to judges and meant for judges, not for grudges. It was meant for judges to say, hey, make sure that the punishment fits the crime. Make sure that the outcome of the offense meets the crime, and it matches the offense that's been that's been shown. And so this was written for judges, not for grudges. But in Jesus' day, they had kind of thrown that away. They had forgotten about that. And it had moved out of the courtroom into everyday life as they were living their lives. And so what it really kind of came down to is like, hey, if someone hurts you, make sure you hurt them back. If someone says something offensive to you, then you might as well say something offensive to them back. And fairness at this point had become like a personal weapon, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I'm just living it out. But Jesus says, he lays down this kingdom ethic that completely flips this on its head, and that would break this cycle of revenge that people were living at this time. And so he gives us these examples one after another. Each one of them is beautiful, and each one of them is incredibly challenging to actually live out. The first one he says is Matthew 5:39. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. Now, what is Jesus really saying as he's saying this? Is turn the cheek is really, what he's really saying is that you should absorb an offense. Don't be offended. Don't let yourself be so offended. Jesus didn't seem to get offended by anything, did he? Now, there is a cultural dynamic at this time that is important to understand, because I think sometimes we read this and we miss what Jesus was really saying. See, for most people who are right-handed, whenever you would slap them on the left cheek, what that really was a sense, a way of utter disrespect for the other person. It was a public humiliation. Whenever you slap someone like this with the back of your hand, it was basically like you saying, you are beneath me. I mean, that was really what that meant. And so what Jesus was saying here is he was not asking victims to endure abuse. What he was really trying to speak to, he was not saying like, just let people beat you up. What he was really saying is like, don't let anyone take the dignity from you. Don't anyone take your identity. Don't anyone tell you who you are or that they're beneath you. And this was Jesus' statement. You don't have to retaliate in this situation. Don't let anyone else in their actions or by their words define your worth. The only person that can define your worth is God. God says who you are, whose you are, and what you're worth. And so you don't have to strike back. You don't have to match their tone. You don't have to strike back at them, because your value comes from something else. And then Jesus goes on in Matthew 5:40, says this, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your cloak as well. This makes no sense, but what Jesus was saying is give your cloak means like, hey, let go of your rights. Let go of your rights. Allow God to defend you. See, again, a little context here. In Jewish law, the cloak was completely off limits. I mean, you could sue people for things, but at the end of the day, you couldn't really take someone's cloak, because the cloak was it was needed for their protection, that they could go out into the weather and into the environment, and it would be protection for them. So if you sued them, you really couldn't sue them for their cloak. It was your right to keep your cloak. That was something that you just had as your personal right. But Jesus is saying like, hey, I know that's your right, but let it go anyway. Why? Because Jesus is saying, don't trust that man is going to provide for you your protection. Trust that God is going to provide your protection and your cover. God is your source. Allow God to be your source. God is going to cover you. And then Jesus continues on, and maybe the strongest example of them is Matthew 5:41 says this, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. In other words, go the extra mile means choose unexpected grace, even in the face of someone doing something to you that seems completely unfair. Now, this one would have hit a nerve. I mean, this was the exact opposite in a way of what Jewish people would have wanted to hear at this time. See, because under Roman law, Roman soldiers could force Jewish people, or really any citizen, to carry all of their equipment to be a Roman soldier, their pack, their sword, their weapons, and it was heavy. It was like 60 to 100 pounds. They could force them legally to carry that for them for 1 mile. And this was not a request. It wasn't like, hey, if you feel like it, carry this pack with me, walk with me for 1 mile down this path. This was the law. It was an expectation. And if you resisted this, you could be beaten or even arrested in this situation. And so the soldiers, I mean, they would kind of abuse this, you can imagine. They were not asking Jewish people, Roman soldiers were not asking Jewish people nicely, hey, if you would, it would be really nice for you to carry my pack. No, they looked at them with contempt, with disrespect, and they kind of had a power that they would lord over the people. And so just imagine with me for a moment what it might have been like to be a first century Jewish person, and you're walking down the path. You're trying to get food for your family. You have some things that you have some errands to run. You're trying to get to your job, whatever. You've got something going on. And all of a sudden you see a soldier in the distance and he points to you. And suddenly you have no choice. You have to pick up his pack and walk with this soldier who really is the one oppressing you in the first place. I mean, and oftentimes, it would be like 90 degrees. It'd be the sun is scorching. The pack is digging into your shoulders. Your muscles are aching, right? You're sweating and sweat's getting into your eyes, and you're seething probably with anger and frustration. And you're silent and you're counting every step until you can get to this 1 mile and you can finally be done with this. And then finally you see it. There's the 1 mile marker, and you get to that point where you finally get to the end and you're carrying this 100-pound pack on your back, and you drop it with a thud and you think, that's it, I'm done. And then this is the moment where Jesus looks at you and says, why don't you pick it up and walk 1 more mile with that soldier? See, that moment, that's the second mile moment. The first mile is always what you owe to someone. That you just go as far as what you kind of owe them. But the second mile, when you go the second mile with someone, that's what you offer them. And that's what Jesus is saying here. In the first mile, this is what's required of you in a relationship, in a situation. It's what expected. It's what the law demands. But the second mile, that's where the soldier, you have to imagine, if you already walked, soldiers have done this 100 times. No one's asking to go an extra mile with a soldier. So that moment, you have to imagine the person says, hey, why don't I walk another mile with you? And the soldier looks at them completely surprised, confused, befuddled, saying, wait, what? You want to walk another mile with me? Why? Why would you do that? Why are you still walking? See, here, this is where grace begins to speak louder than words. This is the moment where the unexpected gets planted into someone's heart. And I think so often this is where conversation happens. This is where the story begins to shift, where you begin to have this conversation like, why would you do that? And suddenly there's a conversation that might not have happened otherwise. That was true in this example, but it's true in our lives as well. Now, in case you're thinking, okay, that sounds nice. That's that's impossible. How can Jesus ask me this? Jesus didn't ask us to do anything that he didn't do himself. In fact, this teaching, I think, is really a reflection of, a foreshadowing of Jesus walking the extra mile for you and for me. Because Jesus carried something. He carried a cross, not a Roman pack. And he went literally the extra mile to a hill called Calvary, where he was beaten, betrayed, burdened with a cross that he didn't deserve. Certainly wasn't his fault. He was mocked. He was abandoned. And there he would die for the very people that he came to save. And he was sentenced to death by the very people that he came to save. And Jesus could have said, hey, wow, Father, I've gone far enough with these people. I have tried to show them love. I've healed people. I've tried to do exactly what you've called me to do, Father. They have rejected me. They don't seem to care. They don't deserve my forgiveness. But instead, Jesus went further. In fact, Jesus didn't settle the score. He rewrote the story because he was willing to walk that extra mile for you and for me. The cross is the ultimate second mile. It's a reminder every time we think about it that Jesus is willing to forgive us. And so how can we forgive others in our lives? So let me just think back here where we've been. I've gone far enough. We've all been there. I've gone far enough. We've reflected on the truth that Jesus went further, and he asked us to do that. But here's the real question as we get to the end of this, is that will we walk with him? Will we walk with Jesus? And that's the last thing that I want to see, is that I will walk with him. What does that look like? What does that mean? I was thinking back this past week to a handful of times I've done a 100-mile bike ride, what's known as a century. And whenever you have done 100 miles, especially if you've been pushing it to try to keep your pace up or whatever, you get to this end of the 100 miles and you're like a mile or two away and you are dying. Your legs are burning and you're looking at the finish line at the end of that 100 miles and you're thinking, I cannot wait until I'm done. And then whenever you finally get to the end, you want to get off that bike. You just collapse into a ball and you don't want to do anything. And you want to just eat a bunch of food and just relax for a couple days. And you're like, I'm done. I did it. I'm at the finish line. Maybe you've experienced that if you've done a race or a run or something like that or something really hard. And so imagine the moment then where you finally get to the finish line and Jesus looks at you and he says, okay, you did it. Now get on your bike and do 100 more miles. I mean, and honestly, that's exactly what it feels like sometimes when Jesus is asking of this in our own relationships. We've forgiven someone. Again, we've already extended kindness in our lives. We've been faithful. We've tried. We've done our part. And we think that we've made it to the finish line. God, I've done enough. I've done my thing. I've loved this person enough. I've extended enough grace, haven't I? And then Jesus in this moment says, now go again. And if that's where you are, I get it. This is not an easy thing to do. This is a challenging message. Now, here's the truth. I don't think any of us are probably going to have to carry a Roman soldier's pack on our back for a mile this week, but I think every one of us has a chance to go a second mile this week. All of us have second mile moments, second mile opportunities in our lives, and that'll be true this week for you as well. And so what does that look like? It might be reaching out to someone who hasn't reached out to you. It might be being patient with a child who's just tested your grace and your patience again and again. It might be forgiving a spouse, a sibling. They just keep falling short. They're not living up to what you think they should live up to, and you just have to say, it's okay. Maybe it's praying for someone who's wounded you, as Jesus asks us to in this passage. Or maybe it's like, I'm going to serve, maybe it might be, I'm serving at the church again, even though I haven't felt like I've been thanked enough to do that. I still want to go the extra mile. Sometimes the second mile is dramatic. Sometimes it's a big dramatic thing. But more often, whenever we're walking the second mile, it's quiet, it's costly, and maybe no one else even knows that you're doing it for someone. Now, let me pause here and just give us one caveat, because Jesus' words here are not a reason or an excuse or a license for someone to abuse you, for toxic relationships in your life. There's a point where it comes and it's not healthy for you to be in that relationship, in that situation. I mean, if someone's abusive, manipulative, toxic, grace does not mean staying back and allowing a cycle of harm to continue to happen in your life. And there's moments where, honestly, the most faithful thing you can do, you've extended enough grace, you've gone as far as you can, and the situation is so unhealthy and so toxic that you have to just take a step back and set a boundary and say, this isn't right for me. And so that's not weakness, that's wisdom. And if that's you, it's hard sometimes to figure out whether your situation is that or not. But grace is not a license. Your safety matters, your soul matters. And so if you're unsure if your situation falls into this category, my encouragement would be to find a trusted friend to share what's going on in your situation. That's why community matters. That's why the church matters. That's why showing up here on a Sunday matters, that we can have these conversations with other people and we can hear them speak into situations in our lives. But I have to say this, that so often we use this excuse that it feels like it's, I've gone far enough, and we really haven't. We're just kind of tired. We're just kind of fed up. It's not that it's completely toxic or completely unhealthy or that's the person's abusing us. It's just that we've lost patience, honestly. And so here's the ask that I have that I'm going to encourage you to reflect on this week. Where have you hit your mileage limit? And what is your next step of grace? Where it is in your life, is there a person, is there a situation, a circumstance where you have hit your mileage limit, and how can you show up and extend grace to that person in your life? Maybe it's a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a prayer you've stopped praying at some point, a kind word that feels just too hard to give. And so let me challenge you to get today. Don't let your pride keep you at mile marker 1. That first mile is what required, but the second mile is so good because that's where Jesus meets you in that moment. This is your second mile moment. This is your opportunity to live out Jesus' words. And so my question for you this week is, will you keep walking even when it's hard? One last story to wrap us up. There's an incredible author, Corrie ten Boom. And in 1947, just a few years after World War II, Corrie ten Boom traveled to Munich. And as she was traveling, she was preaching about forgiveness, which is incredible because she had survived one of the darkest places in human history. She was a Jewish girl that had been in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. I mean, this is one of the most gruesome, difficult concentration camps of the entire Nazi regime. And Corrie ten Boom was there. And in fact, She was beaten there, she was abused there, and her beloved sister Betsy died at the hands of guards in starvation in that same concentration camp. And so Corrie, I mean, just think about this. She had lived through the Holocaust. She had seen the very worst that humanity could offer. And yet there she was in the heart of Germany in Munich, speaking and preaching about forgiveness. Now, Corrie gave this incredible message talking about forgiveness and how she had walked through this after her experience in the concentration camp. And after she spoke these words, the entire room was silent. And there's this kind of heavy silence that lingers as people are processing. They're just kind of trying to figure out what she had said and how important it was. And then as this crowd is kind of standing at the end of her message, Corrie ten Boom looks through the crowd and she sees him. In the back of the room was someone she recognized. The man was older now than when she remembered him. He was balding, kind of polite, but he was holding his hand by his side, his hat by his side, but she knew this face. As she looked at this face, she knew this face. She recognized this face. In fact, this face was the face of one of the guards at Ravensbrück concentration camp. And he was part of the suffering and the abuse and the humiliation that she experienced there at that time. And amazingly, this man had stepped and listened to this entire thing, this message that Corrie ten Boom had given, and he walks to the front to speak with her after she is done. And he stepped forward and he just said, wow, can I just say thank you for that message? Because I've been struggling with forgiveness. I've been struggling to forgive myself, and I've been trying to wrestle with what this all means. And in the process of this, over the last couple of years, I've given my life to Jesus. And I've understood and accepted his forgiveness of me, even despite the things that I've done in my life. But I have to ask you a question, and this is a hard question. And he looked right at Corrie ten Boom in her eyes, and he said, will you forgive me? And in this moment, Corrie froze. Every memory of that terrible experience in that concentration camp came like a tidal wave back into her memory. Betsy's face, the fear that she experienced, the cruelty, the injustice, the beatings, the starvation that they were experiencing. And in that moment, I mean, and it makes sense, she did not feel forgiveness. That was not her first reaction whenever she looked at this man. And in fact, she was struggling with how to respond in this situation. And he extends a hand, and Corrie ten Boom sitting there, and her hand she was trying to move her hand. She wanted to move her hand, but her hand wouldn't move. It wouldn't lift. It was frozen because she was just so shocked by the situation. And in that moment, she whispered this prayer. She said, Jesus, I just have to say, I can't lift my hand right now, but maybe with your help, I can. I don't feel forgiveness in my heart right now, Jesus, but maybe if I can have enough strength to lift my hand, maybe you'll give me the experience to be able to forgive this man. And slowly she began to lift her hand, and slowly she raised it, and their two hands met. And in that moment, she said something that was so profound. She said, and I want to just read this. As I did this, as I shook his hand, an incredible thing took place. A current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, and spread into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. And she says these words, I forgive you, brother, I cried. I forgive you with all my heart. And later, Corrie ten Boom would reflect back on this experience, and she said it was one of the most significant, profound experiences of Christ's love and forgiveness that she had ever had in her entire life. And she did not feel forgiveness at first. She took a step first towards him. She acted first. And in the second mile, when she went the second mile to extend grace and forgiveness, that's where grace met her. That's where Jesus met her. See, Corrie picked up the second mile, not because it was fair. It wasn't fair in that situation, but because Jesus had walked the path before her, and Corrie wanted to walk with Jesus. See, Jesus didn't just talk about grace. He embodied it. He didn't teach about love. He carried a cross to prove his love for us. Jesus didn't just stop at, I've done enough. He went further than anyone ever has before him or after him, further than fairness would require. See, Jesus didn't settle the score. He rewrote the story, and because of that, our story, my story, your story is different. That's the gospel. And that's why we walk with Jesus. And that's why we find this blessing as we do it. And so let me end with this. Will you walk with him? Will you walk with Jesus? Will you walk with Jesus one more mile, even whenever you've gone one and he says, go one more with me? Maybe Jesus is whispering to you, pick up your pack, take one more step. I carried your pack. I carried your sin. I carried your shame. I carried your mistakes on the cross. And I want to give you the strength to take one more step to live this out in your own life. So let me pray right now. Lord, wow, I struggle to go the first mile sometimes, let alone to go the second mile. And so, Lord, but I know that when we live this out, when we walk that second mile, that's where you meet us. That's where grace meets us. That's where the story changes. That's where conversation happens. That's where people say, why? Why would you go even further? Why would you extend grace when you don't have to, when I don't deserve it? And so, Lord, I just pray that we would go the second mile and we would walk it with you. Lord, give us discernment in those situations where it feels like grace is not warranted, and maybe even situations that are unhealthy or even toxic or abusive. Lord, give us wisdom on how to handle those situations. Lord, I know this is not a license for someone to abuse us, but it is an invitation for us to extend grace and for us to find your grace in the midst of that, to live out these words. And so often, Lord, this is where life change happens. This is where your grace shows up. This is where your love is made real. It's not easy, but it is good and it's powerful and it changes lives. I pray that it would change each one of ours. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.